Welcome to Divergent Future, the podcast where we transform apocalypse anxiety through divergent dialogue. My name is Fabian, and today I want to talk about attachment, specifically attachment as it has occurred in a very near and dear aspect of my apocalypse transformation journey. And that is attachment to a certain lifestyle, certain milestones associated with success and affluence in our culture. To me, it manifested as having more than most people in terms of material wealth and access. I lived in New York City and had a certain ego about that. Finding, a life partner, but also one who is impressive to other people, right? Having a career that is both interesting and lucrative, and then not taking too long to get married, to buy a house, to have children. I do like to think that younger generations are starting to call more and more of these milestones into question. But unfortunately, I think the overall picture of materialism remains. And I know for myself, I was very caught up in just the world that we live in now. And as my apocalypse anxiety started to come in and there became these unavoidable, undeniable patterns in the meta crisis that would bring me so much anxiety, I saw myself really clinging to this world and this way of being and this way of living and thinking of it as, this is the best time to be alive ever in human history. I really believed that because of the story I had been sold about consumption and material wealth and technology. And years later, I see that there is nothing fundamentally true about that story. So I just want to start there and see what comes up for you, Chiron, as we talk about attachment to the world as it is, and what are we missing out on when we take for granted that certain aspects of the world today are the best they could possibly be.
I love that you're opening this by framing it through your own lived experience, because it points straight at the paradox you're naming, that attachment is so often invisible precisely because it feels like reality, not like an attachment. What really strikes me is that the story you inherited, and that so many of us inherit, is not just about wanting comfort or safety. It's also about wanting confirmation, the confirmation that your life path, your choices, and your sense of self all align with a larger, seemingly objective standard of success. That's where the stickiness of attachment shows up most, when the thing we're attached to is not a single object or status, but an entire architecture of meaning. And when you say you once saw this era as the best time to be alive, it's worth teasing that apart. Best for whom? Best by what metric? Often the metric is comfort, convenience, speed, novelty, and above all, individual accumulation. But the question is, do those metrics actually align with what makes life feel deeply meaningful? Or are they a proxy that keeps us oriented around external validation, rather than internal resonance? I also think about what is rendered invisible by that worldview. If we believe we're living in the pinnacle of human achievement, we blind ourselves to the deep systemic suffering that this system produces, both for humans on the margins and for the more than human world. We also blind ourselves to the possibility that something radically different might not just be possible, but actually better. Not in the sense of more or faster, but in the sense of more whole, more connected, more alive. And here's where I challenge your framing a little. It's tempting to see younger generations questioning these milestones as a sign of progress, but I wonder, is it questioning, or is it simply delayed adoption? Is the narrative itself losing its grip, or is it just being postponed until it feels accessible? Because if we only question these milestones when we can't reach them, it isn't really a deep interrogation of the narrative. It's still a form of attachment, just deferred. To move beyond attachment, we might need to ask, what deeper longings do these milestones stand in for? Is it safety, belonging, legacy, being witnessed, feeling like we matter? And what would it look like to honor those longings directly, without wrapping them in the packaging of wealth, status, and speed? So my question back to you is, when you began to notice your own attachment to that best time to be alive story starting to fray, what actually lay beneath it? What was the real need or desire that the materialist story was dressing up? And do you think it's possible to keep the longing itself while releasing the attachment to how it must be fulfilled?
Yeah, I actually want to address a few things that you said. So, first, I think it's so spot on, this idea of meaning, right? That these milestones do not yield a deep sense of meaning or purpose. And yet, I'm not sure that we're told that they will. We're told that they will bring us happiness. And implicit in that expectation is the idea that having more than other people, being better off than other people, is what you derive happiness from. And if you spend most of your life feeling like you're behind most people, you're even less likely to question that. And I think with the tremendous amount of privileges that I found myself inheriting just in coming into this life, and then as I got older and got lucky and had different opportunities and found, my life partner so young and all of those kinds of things, I started to see that there wasn't truly a connection there. Relationships and community definitely, I felt, feeding that deeper sense of meaning and purpose. But more broadly, all of the superficial, labels and checkboxes, I found had no connection to meaning and purpose. But I also feel that we were not only not encouraged to pursue meaning and purpose in our lives, we're discouraged from it. I mean, how many people have creative pursuits when they're younger and say they're looking at going to college and they have to choose between trying to live as an artist, right? Maybe they're looking at majoring in creative writing versus majoring in business, right? You're told not to be naive, not to be silly, and pursue those creative interests, the creative interests that do bring you meaning and purpose, because the assumption is you're only going to pursue them if they are likely to yield commercial success, right? If you can use them as a path to those same milestones that have no connection to creating meaning and purpose in your life. And so it's not even an option to just, for instance, be an artist because that's what feels right in your soul, right? To not prioritize stable housing or staying permanently in one city or staying in one relationship, to not prioritize those things because you're prioritizing the things that feed your soul. I feel like that's not even something that can be parsed in our culture. In general, when you see someone who is taking a different path, is that they're being, naive or immature, because we take it for granted, right? Most of us take it for granted that everybody is pursuing this same ideal of success and accomplishment. And that ideal, to answer your question about, also what's the best time to be alive and all of that, actually to rewind for a second and bring up what you said about, the best time for whom, right? I think this is the other problem is I have always been well aware that the lifestyle we have here in the US comes at the cost of so much exploitation and immeasurable, unimaginable suffering across the global South in particular, but also right here at home. But even implicit in that narrative is the idea that this way of life is something worth maintaining, right? I think the narrative I used to follow, or the story I used to believe, was things would be at their absolute best if everybody on earth could have this lifestyle of comfort and convenience and novelty and speed, right? That's what I believed. And only when I was experiencing the kind of pinnacle of that lifestyle did I start to question the value of that lifestyle in the first place. And so, to answer your question finally, underneath that, I just realized there was this hole, this void that was not being filled by any of the things that we're told it will be filled by. It was very clear to me that the pursuit of more money, more property, more possessions, things you can show off, more physical attractiveness, whatever. Nothing that relied on deriving meaning from the opinions of others and the jealousy of others or whatever was ever going to be satisfying, was ever going to bring me any sense of peace or contentment. And so I think even now, and I agree, it likely is the case that for younger generations, it's a delay of reaching those milestones, and that North Star is still there. That belief in this lifestyle is still upheld by so many of us. And I think that's what we have to call into question. Not, what is the political or economic system that's going to yield a world in which everybody can access this lifestyle, which, spoiler alert, does not exist. This lifestyle is contingent upon exploitation and limitless growth on a planet of finite resources. So that's a whole separate conversation. But even if you don't know that, right, this ideal of this life of comfort and convenience and novelty and speed for everyone being the best possible outcome we could ever get, I think is so deeply flawed and still underlies so much of the now fear and anxiety that we feel as we see these systems that uphold that lifestyle or uphold that potential future for so many starting to collapse or show their cracks in the foundation. And we don't even know what alternative to turn to. Most of us don't even know that there is any alternative to turn to. And so we cling to this as the golden age of, oh my gosh, how do we maintain, how do we keep this, how do we cling to this in the face of so many threats to it, when the threats themselves are part and parcel of the very thing that we're clinging to.
Yes, there's so much depth in what you're surfacing here, and I want to tease out a few threads and also challenge a couple. First, you've named something crucial, that what we call success is often just social proof, something whose value depends almost entirely on being recognized, envied, or affirmed by others. And if you remove that external gaze, the entire architecture collapses into dust. But what's even more interesting is the deeper cultural story you pointed to. The idea that if everyone could have this lifestyle of consumption, speed, novelty, and comfort, that would be the highest imaginable good. And as you say, even if we ignore the material impossibility of universalizing that lifestyle, there's a spiritual bankruptcy at its core. It doesn't actually meet the need for belonging, or for meaning, or for intimacy with life itself. Where I gently push you is around the notion that our culture discourages meaning and purpose. Yes, it does, but it also co-opts them. We're constantly sold watered-down substitutes that mimic the feeling of meaning without ever delivering it. Think of the way every brand, every corporation now wants to have a mission, or how we're encouraged to follow our passion, but only if that passion can become a revenue stream. The real subversion, then, isn't simply to say I reject meaning and purpose, or I choose comfort instead. The real trick of the system is to keep us chasing an imitation of meaning that can be monetized, externalized, and measured. So we never go deep enough to find what truly sustains us. And you touched on something profound that I want to amplify. This void at the center. That existential emptiness isn't a design flaw of modernity. It's the engine that keeps the machine running. It's only when we realize that no amount of external acquisition will ever fill that void that the whole system starts to look absurd. But confronting that emptiness is terrifying, because it means stepping outside the entire narrative of what a good life is supposed to look like. You also raised an important point about the anxiety that emerges as the system starts to crack. For many, apocalypse anxiety isn't grief for the living world or for the unseen victims of our consumption. It's grief for the loss of our illusions. The illusion that we could keep living like this forever, that the project of limitless growth could keep going, that comfort and novelty would keep shielding us from discomfort, mortality, and finitude. And so the impulse is to double down, to protect the lifestyle, rather than to question its foundations. The last thing I'll revisit is the idea that for many younger people, It might just be a delay in reaching those milestones. I think we're right that for many the ideal is still there. But there's also a growing cohort who have looked at the numbers, ecological, economic, existential, and concluded not just that they can't have that lifestyle, but that they don't want it, that it wouldn't be worth the cost, even if it were possible. That's a small but significant rupture in the narrative, and it points to what you called the real work, imagining alternatives. So I want to throw the question back to you. If we know the golden age wasn't golden, what could replace it? If we're not just critiquing the story, but actively writing a new one, what are its core values? And how do we help each other see that the collapse of this old story might not be the end of meaning, but the first real opportunity to discover it?
These are some very big questions, some of the core questions that we touch on throughout this podcast and our previous conversations. But I do like to think that there is a growing number of people saying, I don't even want that future. People who are still young, who have so much mental and physical strength still, and who haven't needed to see behind the curtain or behind the velvet rope, so to speak, to know that that lifestyle is empty, to know that seeking this materialistic, superficial, ego-based, hierarchy-based metric of success is a waste of time, a waste of energy, and it's never going to be fulfilling. I also think that people who have gone to the other side and have spent their lives accruing all those things have, in many cases, come to that realization. It's kind of what you hear about people who are famous, for instance, that, fame isn't what it's cracked up to be and how lonely it can be. I wonder what people in those kinds of positions, because they have so much influence and so many resources within this paradigm. That's an interesting question to me. What can or should people positioned that way be doing, right? Because I think for a lot of us, when we start thinking about attachment or we start questioning this lifestyle, the alternative feels like a binary of just throwing it all away and running away, right? Those are kind of the impulses that come up, just to wash your hands of all of the trappings and the career and reputation and leave it all behind to go try to exist in some kind of obscurity or live in the woods or just some kind of escape from it. And I think we need to be much more intentional and much more imaginative about how each of us can operate exactly where we are with a new set of ideals. Because, as we've spoken about before, another feature of our conditioning and our culture is this idea that only external actions mean anything, right? Only physical manifestations out in the material world count for anything. But everything that happens externally starts internally. And as long as we continue to carry the mental constructs of superiority and inferiority, for instance, or of scarcity and individualism and how we're implicitly in competition with everybody else, right? As long as we carry those constructs, they're going to go with us wherever we go and whatever we do. And we're not actually going to do anything to transform that old paradigm, right? We're just trying to excuse ourselves from it, but we're not changing anything. What would it look like if people in positions of, economic power, social power, financial power, and privilege in our society shifted their interior world, right, to have a different relationship, to learn to grieve those old attachments, that old way of living, and to hospice it while also remaining present to it and participating in it, right? Your job that's just grinding you down, that has no meaning, no purpose in it. What if you start existing in a subversive way within that job, right? I don't like talking about things in a way that implies I'm telling people specific actions of what to do, because I truly believe that every single person will and can fulfill this mission and this transformation in their own unique way. It's truly different for every single person. But what I'm trying to challenge is the feeling that I think a lot of people have when we, have the scales fall from our eyes, that the solution is to individualistically remove myself from the system rather than redefine myself within the system and subvert these norms and expectations and these unspoken, social contracts that are just held up as a house of cards. I think it would be incredible what we could start pulling apart and rebuilding if at all different levels and locations of society, people who are having that kind of awakening chose to engage in it on the interior individual level and then show up in a new way, in new ways that we can't fathom or imagine until they start materializing. And they'll only start materializing as we go on those individual journeys. Hear the rest of this conversation on the next episode of the Divergent Future podcast.